Firstly, I'd like to thank you for inviting me, Eugen especially for inviting me to talk at today's Wuyong Book Club meeting. I'm sorry I'm losing my voice, so after 10 minutes I may not have any more left, so we'll just have to wait and see what happens. You can see from the people in the room and the people that were on that video that those people have had a long history in Australia. Whereas most of the people here in the room today may have a history of maybe 20 years or 10 years or 30 years. And so we're all, as the Chinese community, we're all part of a journey. And so I think of us being connected to those people, even though you've only come here very recently, we're all connected on the same journey. And I sort of relate it to like a bus, that the first guy who didn't look Chinese at all, his great-great-great-grandfather came in 1818, and he got on the first bus stop in 1818. My great-great-grandfather came in 1835. So I've been here for 5 generations, and he got on the bus in 1835. You might have got on the bus in 2020 or 2015 or only last year, but we're all on the same journey. And I think the experiences that we have on the journey, whether you arrived 100 years ago or today, we have the same challenges when we arrive in Australia. When I speak to people, the challenges are all the same. When they arrive here, they can't speak the language. They find it hard to connect with people. There's been racism for 200 years, and there's racism now. So the story hasn't changed very much. The principles of the story haven't changed very much. So when you look back in history, what the actual museum shows is examples that you're not alone in the history of Chinese Australians. We share the same common issues. So, but unfortunately, if I was to say, in the next, for you, if you have children and your children have children and your children have children, it may end up like me because I can't speak Chinese anymore. I never learnt Chinese when I was young. My mother was born here. My grandfather was born here. So they didn't speak Chinese either. But some people continue their heritage by marrying other Chinese people. So that's why I'm fully Chinese. Whereas that first guy who came on, Nick, when his great-great-grandfather came, he married an Irish woman, and then he had no other relatives in their family that were Chinese. So he might be only one part Chinese. But we call all of those people Chinese Australians. And I'll show you another video that's quite interesting, that's about our relationship way back during the gold rush, about Aboriginal people and Chinese people. So I'm trying to show you that Chinese Australians are not looking all the same. They are quite different. There's quite a lot of Chinese Australians and from all over the place. So if you think of Chinese being Chinese like Europeans are European, it's much the same. As you know, in China, the north of China is quite different to the south of China. The west is different to the east. In Europe, Italians are different to Swedish people, different to Spanish people. I sort of equate the fact that when you talk about Chinese people, the culture is very broad, and so therefore we're not looking all the same. So one of the key things we talk about for Chinese people is we talk about Chinese people as one society or one community, but we talk about 1 million stories, and the 1 million stories are we all have different stories. I would like to find that video. I don't know, maybe you don't have it. No, not that one. No, it's not here actually. Maybe, no, it's a bit hard to find. I actually sent it, but it hasn't arrived. Anyway, what I wanted to say is we're doing a 2-year research about the history of Aboriginal and Chinese people. And the difference being that in the 1850s, about 40,000 Chinese people came to Australia looking for gold because it was quite hard going in China. So they came to Hong Kong was a British port, Melbourne was a British port, so they found it easy to come from Hong Kong to China, to Australia. The other reason they came just before the gold rush is that Australia was a convict colony, and the English government would send convicts to Australia. It was a penal colony, a jail for convicts. And in 1840, they said, we're not going to send any more convicts to Australia. So what happened then is they were short of labour. So they said, oh, we can get cheap labour from China. So Hong Kong was the nearest port to Sydney. So the labourers started coming from China in the 1840s. But the big difference was in the 1850s when gold was discovered. And at that time, as you saw on there, the 40,000 Chinese people came. The other predominant population in Australia was Aboriginal people, other than English colonial people. And it so happened that Chinese people were spread all over, because they mined for gold, they got spread all over Australia, the country, Australia, in the cities everywhere. Aboriginal people were the same. They were all over Australia, in the countryside. And it's funny for me to tell you that people don't realise that Irish women also came to Australia. Now, Irish women, Chinese people, and Aboriginal people, they were all a subclass. They were all the lower level class. So these three groups of people, Aboriginal women, Irish women, and Chinese men, got on together quite well. So we just did the 2-year study and found that there are tens of thousands of Aboriginal Chinese people across the whole of Australia. No one has done a proper research on this. And in 3 years' time, we're creating an exhibition, and we're going to send it to Australian National University in Canberra, and then it's going to go to Beijing at the National Museum. So then after that, and so when you ever meet any person who's from the gold rush who looks Caucasian, they say, oh, my great-grandmother was married to a Chinese guy in the gold rush. And always, oh, she was Irish. So those social circumstances made the Chinese part of society. They weren't just like stuck in Chinatowns or stuck in their own enclaves. They were quite diverse across the whole nation. So that's why in that introductory video, you see lots of people who don't look fully Chinese at all. The starting people don't look Chinese. So you've got to understand that whilst I look Chinese, many Chinese Australians don't look Chinese at all. And some of the sad stories that I could show you, I could go on for a long time, by the way. A lot of the stories I show you, the people say, because of racism during the course of the last 100 years or so, there are stories where a little boy comes home from school singing a racist song. He doesn't realise he's been taught by his schoolmates. And his mother says, don't sing that song. And he says, why? He says, because you're Chinese. And the son says, he's only 5 years old. He says, what's Chinese? He said, don't tell anybody you're Chinese. That's the kind of thing that happened during the course of unfortunately, during the course of our Chinese-Australian history. So that's sort of where we are. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is who are Chinese Australians. And the common platform the Chinese museums say is that we have Chinese ancestry, we have Chinese heritage, and we live in Australia. We don't mind whether they've come from Singapore, whether we've come from Singapore, Malaysia, East Timor, Vietnam, Cambodia. All the Chinese people who have come from those places, mainland China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, we all live in Australia, we're all Chinese Australians. And the museum sees that as the overarching community of people. Although individually, we are individual, like as groups of people. Even in China, we come from Guangdong province, where Jiangsu people, or we're Shanghainese people, which is very close, or we're Cantonese people. We have those regional aspects, but when we come to Australia, we try to embrace everybody as one community. And I think having that knowledge, that thought, and also having the idea that there are people who have gone before you, you can learn from those experiences, from those people. I've been here all my life, and I can explain. Sorry. I can explain, put things into context for people. When they say, I don't understand why why Australian people are so racist. I can explain that to people why Australian people are so racist, when people just don't realise. Now, so I'll address that in our history when I talk about the history of Chinese Australians, or the history of Chinese people in Australia. I'll explain a bit more about that. But I think the idea of Chinese people helping Chinese people, I think, is a very important thing for us to do in our society, Chinese Australian society. So that's one thing I would like to hope we can part on that idea. Now, the other thing is I wanted to talk about is what is our 200-year history? Now, I said that the 200-year history started in 1818. Oh, I'm dropping all my things. When the first Chinese Australian came here, Chinese person came here. But before that, in the 1700s and the 1800s, Chinese people were dealing with Aboriginal people way back then because they, I don't know the Chinese name, you know, the sea cucumber. Sea cucumber. Asian, yeah. The Chinese people, there was a delicacy in China, and it grew in Northern Territory, in the reef. Aboriginal people knew that, so they would harvest it and dry it, and then send it off to China. Via the Makassar people, the Indonesian people would be the people who would be the traders. Aboriginal people would give it to the Indonesian people would sell it to the Chinese people. Chinese people came then, just a short stay, and went back. But that's when the first Chinese people came. But then 1818, Makassar came under... Australia became founded in 1788 when Captain Cook came and sort of said, oh, I think we'll give you a few things, Aboriginal people, and make this land our land instead. So I think that 1788 was the time when the first colonists came, and then 40 years later, Sydney was established. Oh no, the first Chinese person came 40 years later. And then, as I said, the next generation of people came in the 1840s when the government stopped bringing convicts over. And then after that, the gold rush started. And that's I think, the time when Australia became a multicultural society, because Chinese people came in quite some number, and that changed the face of what Australia looked like. Believe it or not, in that day, and Melbourne was the first place where gold was found in 1851, when you went out into the street in 1851, 25% of the population walking in the street were Chinese people. Today, the population of the city of Melbourne is 25%. Now, if you go through the census of how many people live in this municipality of Melbourne, the city of Melbourne, it's 24.6% of all people living in Melbourne are Chinese people. So it's quite funny how this whole thing has turned around. But in the meantime, Chinese people had great hardship between then and now. The first racist law came into place in 1857. That's 6 years after the first Chinese people arrived. The non-Chinese people and the government then pressured the government to say, we need to stop Chinese people from coming. So in 1857, they had a tax, a poll tax, at the port of Melbourne. Any ship that came in, if a Chinese person wanted to get off, they had to pay £10. Chinese people didn't have £10 to pay. And so what the Chinese did, they couldn't go back to China. They had to stay on the ship and go around to the next port, which happened to be in South Australia, just over the border from Victoria, because the tax was imposed by the Victorian government. We didn't have an Australian government then. We only had separate states. A bit like the warring states before the Han Dynasty, you know, we had just separate states. So then they got off at Robe, which was just over the border from between Adelaide and Victoria. Robe was a bay. They got off, and they had to walk back to Victoria across the border. And it wasn't illegal to walk across the border. It was just illegal to get off the ship. And so they got off at Robe and just walked back 500 kilometres through the bush. They weren't guided by anybody. They just had to follow the sun and head west to their goldfields. And they just headed west and landed in the goldfields. So that was their start. And then for those who could get off the ship, Chinatown was like a staging post for the Chinese people. You know, the Siap Society, the Kongchu Society, the Nampon Sun Society. They all set up sort of district buildings in Little Bourke Street. And those district buildings welcomed all those people who belonged to those particular counties, and they you know, looked after them, and then refitted them with their provisions and told them what they need to expect in Australia, and then they went off to the goldfields. Now the thing about Chinatown is that our Chinatown still has those buildings in Chinatown, and they're still owned by the same people. The Nampon Sun building is still owned by the Nampon Sun people who built that building. The Kongchu Society, all of those buildings are built by those original people. And this is quite unique in the world. It's not anywhere in any Western country where the Chinese people have stayed in a place and still occupy that place for so long. So that's why we started the museum, because we recognised that Chinatown was the oldest streetscape and nearly society in the Western world. San Francisco started a few years earlier. They were called the Gold Mountain, and we were called the New Gold Mountain, because their gold rush was found 2 or 3 years earlier. But their whole Chinatown burnt down in the 1900s from the earthquakes. But our Chinatown has stayed there, and our people still own the same buildings that we have. So that's why we have this, why we regard Chinatown and the people of Chinatown really important people. We call it a living history. Most historic places, you see the buildings, but they've turned into something else, or they're not the original, they don't have the original purpose, but Chinatown in Melbourne still has that original purpose of welcoming Chinese people into Australia. So the Chinese Museum, other than telling history, we try to advocate for, anti-racism. We advocate for many things for Chinese people. It's not just about the past. And so that's sort of where the Chinese Museum is. And I did want to actually explain to you today, and maybe Charles can help me explain this, is this journey, what happens with history and museums is the way to survive as a museum. This is what I think. The way to survive as a museum is connect the history, which is the past, with the present, and look at the future. Because if you can do that, you can see a trajectory or a pathway forward. If you don't know the past, you only know the present, you just don't know where you are to go. So I call the history, it's just points in time. They're points in time like the gold rush happened in 1851. The first Chinese person came in 1818. The White Australia policy didn't finish till 1975. The first racist law was in this. They're only points of history. They're actually not, they're not a full picture of what we are. The full picture of what we are today is in our heritage. And I just wanted Charles to explain the difference between history, it's placed in Chinese, unless you all understand what I'm talking about. It's places in time, and heritage is what we carry within us. Our heritage is our understanding that we learnt from our fathers, from mother and father, and their and they got their heritage from their parents. And so we all have this idea of heritage that moves forward. And so if you take your history and relate it to your own heritage, then you get an understanding of where you're going. And this is how I found my identity. Because when I was born, I never met any Chinese people. I went to school of 900 children. I was the only Chinese person. This is in the 1950s and 60s. I did this. And there were very few Chinese people. There were only about 20,000 Chinese people on the census. Now there's 1.4 million. So this whole idea of not understanding my history, understanding the little heritage that I have in me, not being able to speak Chinese and all that kind of thing. Once I know these 2 points, I know where I'm going. So this is a very important thing for Chinese people, for their own identity of how they feel as Chinese Australians. Because they've arrived in this country, they might have arrived themselves or their parents might have brought them, or their grandparents. They all have this struggle in the first 1 or 2 generations of where they're going. I ended up where I am, and lots of other people ended up in different places. It's all quite a different journey for everybody. So I think this is really important for people who are new arrivals in Australia to understand that we're sort of all going, like I was talking about the bus, we're sort of all on the same bus, all getting on the bus at different times, and we're all going to get off the bus at different times, but we're all going in the same way. So this is a sort of way that I sort of say the community should try to embrace each other, and those people who have been on the bus for a long time, they can help the people who just got on the bus who say, where are we going now? And I can say, where are we going here? Why are people so racist? Because blah, 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 blah. I can answer a lot of questions that are based on past circumstances that go forward. Now, I think, did you mention to me to actually talk about racism and why we're so racist and immigration? Because people think that, that Australia is racist because of the China-Australia relationship. But it's not to do with the China-Australia relationship, because racism started in 1857 when lots of Chinese people came. The China-Australia relationship, we had none. China had a relationship with Australia. With England, they didn't have a relationship with Australia. We were a British colony in those times. And the relationship between England and China was between the king and the emperor. That was the relationship that time, nothing to do with today. And so really the racism came from the British people who were colonists here, who then listened to the people who stayed here and said Chinese people are too successful. I think you've heard that in many countries around Southeast Asia, Chinese people are too successful. You know, whether it be importing tea, the silk. There's all kinds of stories in history about Chinese people being too successful. Many centuries ago and today, Chinese people too successful. Let's make them leave the country. Whether it be Malaysia, Indonesia, Roman Empire when they were trading too much silk to their English Empire when they're trading too much tea. They had to try to stop this control of Chinese people. And today, trading too much Chinese products, we've got to stop that. So it's not something new, it's something that's been continuous. So the idea of Australians being racist themselves, not the government, not China-Australia politics, is really originates from the fact that the Australian government started the first law in 1857, racist law, and it was okay to be racist, it was lawful, and stopped racism in 1975. That's nearly 120 years of our 200 history that the government said, yeah, we're racist. As in 1975, there was a big change in that decade when we realised that we should be a multicultural society. And what happened was that in 1975, they finally abolished the White Australia policy that began in 1901, went for 75 years. And 1901 was the Federation of Australia, the first Parliament of Australia, which was in Melbourne. Sorry? Well, that's okay. And the first law that they passed was the White Australia policy. The Immigration Act 1901 was one of the first laws they passed, banning people from entering into Chinese from entering into Australia. So that lasted 75 years and was finally deconstructed by 1975, and then only in 1975 did it then become unlawful to be racist as part of the law. And then in that decade, they also said, we want to make this a multicultural society. Before 1975, they wanted a monocultural society. So that's why Aboriginal people were also relegated to, marginalised, because Aboriginal people weren't part of mainstream society. So Chinese people weren't a part of mainstream society. So this is what happened during that period. So if you think that I was mainly brought up in that time, and so are most Australians, so you could easily say that many Australian people being brought up in that time still have the feeling of being racist. They are racist. And that you can't change. It'll come, you can't make a law and say, oh, we don't want you to be racist anymore. It's not an action, it's a feeling. If you are racist, you are racist. You can't change that by law. It's in you. So I think it'll take at least 2 generations before racism leaves us, Australia, because all of those generations have been brought up that way. But there is a second way in which racism will leave us, because racism is about your ancestry. It's about whether you have Chinese ancestry, whether you have Polish ancestry, Russian ancestry, Ukrainian ancestry, New Zealand ancestry. What happens when all the people, like my grandson, or like my daughter, who's only half Chinese, she's also she's Jewish, because my wife's Jewish, she's also half Polish, she's also English, she's also part French. This is my wife. Now then we've had a daughter who is now half Chinese and all of the other things my wife is, and then my wife married an Italian guy, and so now my grandson is half Italian and half all of these other things. So now what race or what ancestry they have all this ancestry. Now my daughter, when she went all overseas, you can't tell where she's from. She went to India, they thought she was part Indian. She went to China, they thought she was part Chinese. She went to South America, they thought she was part South American. She just has this universal face. And I would say that 30% of the world's population will be like that in 3 generations, as we all travel and mix with each other and we, change. In 1965, I remember when my mother and father got on an aeroplane and went overseas. That was a big thing to go overseas. No one travelled before 1965. We were all 1965, Chinese people were in China, English people were in England. We didn't travel, so ancestry was very important. Our country was very important. And I met an African-American person in 1980s. He said, I predict in 2020 that Australia will not be predominantly white anymore. And he was correct. In 2020, Australia wasn't predominantly white anymore. There's more non-Caucasian people than Caucasian people. And he said, I also predict that you won't be identified by race by 2050. I think we're heading that way, that we won't be identified by race. There are many other ways to identify yourself. Oh, I'm a member of the Tottenham Hotspurs, football club. Or I'm a this and that and the other. I'm whatever. You might do it by any other means. So I'm a member of the Wuyong Book Club. That's my identity. So I think there's a lot to be unpacked when it's not that simple as when you look at it at face value and all of these things. It's not that simple to unpack all this story. And so the Chinese Museum wants to provide that kind of message to people. And I find a lot of people who come into the museum that just recently I've met, who leave the museum very, very in tears. I'm saying, oh, what's happened? Did you fall over? What happened? And this last lady who I met, she was 45. She said, I found my identity here. I said, what did you say? I said, I understand where Chinese people have come from. I said, why did you not have your identity? She said, my mother is Chinese and my father's not Chinese. And because I had a disabled sister, and my mother told me I had to look after my sister since I was little. And when I turned 15, I had a nervous breakdown and I couldn't live at home anymore because all I was is the carer of my disabled sister. And so I left home. And she said, my mother disowned me. She said, I don't want to know anything about you. She's never seen her mother since. And so she's seen herself, she's lost her Chinese identity for all that time from 15 years old to 45. And then when she came to the museum, she said, I found it. And that's what we want to do, what we want the Chinese Museum to do, is enable people to understand who they are as Chinese Australians. And so that people can live their lives, you know, have a strong sense of worth and sense of being. And that's why we, as I mentioned before, we have had anti-racism programs, and they're called We Are Strong Within, because really racism is about understanding yourself. It's not about understanding racist people. Racist people are racist people. You can't change racist people. They are just racist. There's no logic to being racist. But you can change yourself by being able to stand up to racist people. If you understand where you are and understand where they are, then you can just stand up to them. It's like someone coming to you in the street and just yelling at you, and you just think, well, why is that person yelling at me? Got no idea. Just walk on. You don't have to feel like racism is a personal attack, because it's not personal. It's just, you're just confronted by this mad person who has this idea that what they say has sense. So that's what we try to do at the museum. We try to empower people to get to understand, you know, who they are, so that they can build a stronger sense of self-worth. I don't know how long I've been speaking for, but maybe you could ask me some questions. Do you want me to? Is that the right time to do that? Have I been talking for very long, by the way? 3 o'clock now.
我先掌声，谢谢。More videos on the play, or
yeah.
to introduce the program?
Yeah. What I'll do is I'll press this. Yeah, okay. I'll just show you what the museum does, and you're most welcome to come. And this is what we do, and our idea is to help us establish our place in Australian society. We have school education. We have online and excursions for all school children. Nationally, we have 30,000 kids come through the museum. That's about 1,000 per week. These are the kinds of activities. This is about Chinese tea. We do talk about Chinese culture. That's the We Are Strong Within program, where we teach kids about anti-bullying. He's a Kung Fu master, by the way, that guy. And he teaches kids about standing up for themselves, and also not to fight, just to stand up for themselves. We have lantern making workshops for education. We talk about modern history, China-Australia relations. This is a bit old, this one. He's not there anymore. Our public engagement, we have very important artists. He's a very prominent Chinese Australian artist. We give talks. We do things like Dragon Boat Festival. This is about Aboriginal Chinese history that we're on about. I'm sorry I couldn't show you that video. The video that we were showing, I wanted to show you, was this Aboriginal Chinese woman who was talking about her. She looks Aboriginal mainly, and part Chinese, and her father's Chinese. And she spent the whole time saying, I really want to know my Chinese past, because her father didn't pass down enough, and she wants to try to find her family in China. And these people are Chinese Aboriginal people that gave a talk. That was an adult program for We Are Strong Within. We have an arts collective where we allow artists to express their heritage. We have exhibitions about Han Dynasty, which is culture, about our gold rush period, about our 1 million stories. In 2018, the census said we've just reached over 1 million Chinese in Australia. So I call this exhibition 1 Million Stories. And that was the 200-year history in 2018. And the mainstream engagement, we're part of Melbourne Comedy Festival. We're part of Melbourne Fashion Week. We put on this show last week that James up in the corner helped us do. He's a great supporter of the Chinese Museum. And we're looking at doing that again this year in September. We bring out the Dragon at Chinese New Year. And our reach, in 2022, we reached 1.5 million Chinese people. Because we got half the audience from China, because we did things in China. We had an exhibition go to Chengdu, Shanghai, Nanjing, Jiangsu, Nanjing, and somewhere else in Jiangsu. We had the exhibition go to 4 places. This 1 million stories. And so Chinese people all over China saw the exhibition. And we promote Chinese Australians through the Australian Embassy, who do a lot with us too. So we're very connected to politics, to people, to communities. We try to cover that whole territory for the community. I don't think there are any organisations quite like us, actually. So, and really our purpose, which is part of our main purpose, is very simple. It's just contributing to a harmonious world. That's our main purpose. And we'd like it to happen between Ukrainians and Russians as well. But you know, we would particularly like it to happen between Chinese and Australians, or Chinese and any other country. So, have I given you enough? Give you enough information for today, or would you like some more to talk about?
I think, we can play some the rest of it.
Yeah, sure.
In the break time, and so.
Yeah, okay, sure. We'll have a break now.
Yeah, we have a break now.
Yeah.
那我们再次感谢 Mark 的分享吧。
Thank you.